The Arizona Territory, 1887. Dawn did not rise over Juniper Crossing, it seeped. A pale, defeated light drained across the basin, catching the spines of yucca and the skeletal arms of ironwood. The wind moved without sound, a dry comb raking the scalp of the desert. It was a land that demanded resilience and offered none in return. The air was thin, tasting only of alkali dust and endings. Rowan Hale stood on the cracked earth of what had once been Hale Orchard. Her jaw was set, a stubborn line inherited from her father, but her palms were her own, mapped with blisters earned from trying to keep the dead from dying. She was counting, not apples, not blossoms, she was counting the survivors. 26, she thought, her lips moving without sound. 26 apple trees still holding a fistful of withered leaves. The rest, more than 200 saplings planted with hope and sweat 2 years prior, were gray skeletons. They looked like kindling, brittle and resigned. The drought had been a killing thing, a slow strangulation that had taken her father last winter. But this final blow was different. This was not nature. This was murder. The water hadn't just stopped. It had been taken. The culprit was the new railroad, a black iron spine pushing west. And the man who owned it, Magnus Breyer. Breyer's progress was relentless, carving through mesas and diverting lives as easily as he had diverted the creek at Raven's Wash. Upstream, hidden from casual view, his men had built a covert rock dam, a plug, a theft disguised as engineering. The railroad needed water for its engines and its work camps. The Hale Orchard, apparently, did not. Juniper Crossing spoke of it in hushed tones over dry goods and weak coffee. The whispers followed Rowan like her own shadow whenever she rode in for scant supplies. Magnus Breyer has his eye on her. He's a widower, you know, and rich as sin. She'll marry him to save her family. What choice does she have? The bargain was never spoken aloud to her, not directly. It hung in the air, thick as the dust that coated the inside of the empty pantry. Magnus Breyer, who had stolen her water, would graciously offer her security. He would save her from the ruin he himself had authored. Rowan felt the proposition around her neck. It was not a lifeline. It was a noose made of silk, soft, expensive, and designed to strangle the fight right out of her. Every time she imagined his smooth, manicured hand resting on her arm, her blistered palms curled into fists, she would sooner set fire to the dead trees herself than take his name. She had tried the law, in Juniper Crossing, was Sheriff Ephraim Pike. 2 days prior, she had ridden into town, her face grim beneath the brim of her father's hat. She'd carried 2 heavy mason jars into the sheriff's office, the silence in the room broken only by the buzzing of a trapped fly. Pike was a man whose ambition had long since outgrown his spine. He was leaning back in his chair, boots on his desk, polishing his badge with his thumb. Rowan had said his name. Just Sheriff, her voice flat, placing the jars on his desk with a heavy, deliberate thud. He'd blinked, annoyed by the interruption and the dust she'd brought in. The first jar held water from above Raven's Wash clear, bright, alive. The second held the sludge she'd spent an hour scooping from the riverbed below the dam site, thick, gray, dead silt. The difference was stark. It was an accusation in glass. "This is proof," she said. "The current runs wrong. He's damned it. He's stealing the wash." Pike didn't look at the jars. He looked at the new, brightly printed re-election poster tacked to his wall. The ink was still fresh. Ephraim Pike Progress and Order. Below it, in smaller, tasteful letters, courtesy of the Arizona Pacific Railroad Development Company. He pushed his hat back, the leather creaking. "Now, Rowan. Stealing is a hard word. Mr. Breyer has territorial water rights. Says so on the paperwork filed down in Prescott. Besides, this silt," he shrugged, a slow, greasy movement of his shoulders that set the tin badge to winking. "Looks like drought to me, just drought. That's not silt from a drought. Ephraim, that's silt from a bottleneck. That's what happens when a living river is choked off. You know it." "I know what the paperwork says," he replied, his eyes going cold and flat. "And I know, Mr. Breyer is bringing jobs to this territory. He's bringing civilization. I suggest you go on home. Pray for rain, like the rest of us. Rowan had looked at the jars of silt, then at the man paid to uphold the law, and saw they were made of the same inert material. She left the jars on his desk. They were probably still there, gathering dust next to his inkwell. Now, standing in the wreckage of the orchard, Rowan watched the horizon. A thunderhead, bruised purple and gray, was climbing the far mesas. It was a terrible tease, a daily betrayal. The sky built these monuments of false hope every afternoon. The wind would shift, smelling of hot metal and ozone, promising a deluge, a cleansing, a relief that never came. The clouds would break apart by evening, scattering without having spilled a single drop. Her dog, Junko, a wiry mix of hound and shadow, nudged his head against her hand. He was whining low in his throat, sensing the despair that rolled off her like heat from the ground. "It's all right, boy," she murmured, scratching his ears. The small act of comfort felt like a lie. "We're not beat yet." Junko, however, was focused on the wash. He trotted ahead, nose down, toward the dry, rocky scar where the creek used to be. He stopped near a clump of brittlebush, pawing at something in the dust. "What is it?" "Junko, found a lizard." He nudged the object with his nose, then barked once, sharp and low. It was not his hunting bark. It was his discovery bark. Rowan knelt, her knees cracking. The dust was fine as flour. It wasn't a rock. It was leather, dark and stiff with dried sweat. She picked it up. It was a charm, or half of one. A disc of thick hide, perhaps bison, burned with the image of a thunderbird. The leather thong that had held it was snapped clean, the break fresh. It had not been here long. It was Apache work. She knew that much. Her gaze sharpened, sweeping the ground around the brittlebush. Junko had found more than the charm. He had found the tracks. Rowan's gut tightened into a cold knot. She knew tracks. She knew the heavy, defined print of a cavalry boot, heel-heavy and nailed. She saw 2 sets of those, but beside them, lighter, almost brushed away, was another print, range-soft moccasins. Her heart began a low, heavy drum against her ribs. Cavalry boots and Apache moccasins, together, at the edge of her stolen water. This wasn't just about a dam. This wasn't just about water rights and railroad contracts. The sheriff's apathy, the whispers of marriage, the dry orchard, it all felt small for a moment. The silt in the jars proved a crime against property. These tracks, paired with this broken thunderbird charm, spoke of something else. They spoke of a violence she couldn't yet name, a danger that felt immediate and personal. The silk noose was one thing. This felt like iron. Rowan stood, the broken charm heavy in her blistered palm. The hot wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, stinging her eyes. She looked up toward Raven's Wash, toward the hidden dam and the stolen water. Sheriff Pike wouldn't look. The town wouldn't look. Magnus Breyer was counting on their blindness. She closed her fist around the leather disc. The thunderbird's edges dug into her skin. A small, sharp pain that focused her. She pocketed the charm. She whistled once for Junko, a sharp, clear sound that cut the heavy air. She strode to the lean-to where her horse, Blue Smoke, a tough-footed roan with a wary eye, stood waiting. Rowan didn't bother with the mounting block. She grabbed the pommel, swung herself up into the worn saddle, and settled her father's rifle into the scabbard. Checking the breech by habit, she turned Blue Smoke north. Junko ran ahead, a black streak against the pale, dry earth. Rowan Hale rode toward the dry belly of the wash, her jaw set, her eyes fixed on the place where the river died. She was going to see what men had done. Raven's Wash was a graveyard. Rowan had left Blue Smoke tied in a stand of mesquite well back from the ravine's edge. Junko pacing nervously at her heels. She descended the loose scree slope on foot, her boots sliding, sending small cascades of pebbles rattling into the silence. The air in the ravine was different dead, hot and holding the faint chemical smell of tar. And then she saw it. It was not a grand piece of engineering. It was a crude, brutal plug, wedged into the narrowest part of the wash. It was a wall of stacked river stone, quarried right from the canyon walls. It was ugly, effective, and fresh. Dark, sticky pitch had been smeared into the gaps, glistening wetly in the oppressive heat. Burlap sacking, stained with the same pitch, was jammed between the larger boulders. It was a work of malice, built not just to stop the water, but to suffocate it. Above the dam, what little water remained was a stagnant, scummy pool, already baking in the sun. Below it, where Rowan stood, was a bed of cracked mud and bleached stones. Her father's orchard, her town's livelihood, had been murdered for this. She stepped closer, her shadow falling across the hot stones. Junko whined, staying back, his nose twitching at the tar smell. Rowan reached out and touched the pitch. It was still tacky. This was recent. Days, perhaps. A single pebble skittered down the rock face opposite her. Junko let out a low, repressed growl. Rowan froze, her hand dropping to the butt of the pistol holstered on her hip. "That belongs to the river." The voice came from the rocks. Not 20 feet away. It was calm, low, and held no echo. It was part of the stone. A man stepped out of a cleft in the shadow. He did not emerge so much as he detached himself from the landscape. He was Apache. He moved with a silence that seemed impossible for a man his size. He was tall, lean-muscled, and wore canvas trousers tucked into range-soft moccasins. The sun had scarred him, leaving patterns of hardship around his eyes and mouth. But his expression was one of absolute, unnerving calm. He looked at the dam, then at her. He was utterly unafraid. Rowan's hand stayed on her pistol. Her heart was a hammer. "Who are you?" The man's gaze dropped to her other hand, the one clenched at her side. "You are the one holding my sister's charm." Slowly, Rowan unclenched her fist. She held out the broken leather disc with the Thunderbird. "I found it, near the tracks, cavalry boots and moccasins." He stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the charm. He did not take it, but knelt, his gaze tracing the burned lines and the snapped thong. His face, already hard, seemed to harden further, into something akin to the granite around them. "It is Taya's," he said, his voice flat. "My sister. The soldiers broke it when they drove her camp from the springs. They said the land was railroad land now. They said it was Briar's land." He looked up, his eyes locking onto hers. "They are gone. She is gone. And I am Callie and Windrunner. I was a scout for the army. Now, I am just an interpreter of bad news." He stood. "You should not be here. Orchardist's daughter. You know who I am. I know Hale Orchard is dry. I know Magnus Briar wants your land, and you, and I know he has hired drifters and a deputy to keep folk away from this." He nodded at the dam. "They will not ask questions. They will paint any trespasser as a thief, or worse, they have bullets to spare." Rowan looked from the calm, dangerous man to the ugly, solid wall of rock. The fear was real, but the anger was hotter. The silk noose Briar offered felt just as deadly as a bullet. "Sheriff Pike already looked away," she said, her voice hard as the stones she stood on. "He saw the silt in my jars and called it drought." She took a breath, the hot, dry air burning her lungs. "If law won't see, it must be made to look." A change happened in Callion's expression. It was not a smile. It was a slight, almost imperceptible tipping at the corner of his mouth. A spark of rare amusement, or perhaps recognition. In his dark eyes, he saw the flint in her. He had not expected the flint. He studied her for a long moment, as if re-evaluating the landscape. "To look," he repeated, tasting the word. He turned his attention back to the dam. "This is a stupid man's work. Strong, but stupid." He moved toward the plug, running his scarred palms over the seams. Rowan, her hand falling away from her pistol, followed him. Junko crept forward, sensing the shift in the air. "You cannot break this with anger," Callion said, his fingers tracing a line where two large boulders met. "Or with dynamite. Blow this, and you blow the whole valley. You'll flood your own orchard with rock and mud. Then what? You bleed it. He pressed his weight against a wedge-shaped stone near the base. It was set wrong, the pitch thick around it as if to hide a flaw. Breyer's men built it fast. They used this as the plug, the final piece. They sealed it from the outside, but the river is already pushing. It wants to go home. He showed her. Here. A single steel wedge, driven here, and another here. It will not break the dam. It will bleed the water back. It will release the pressure without blowing the valley. The river will do the rest of the work. It will find its old bed. He was mapping the dam's seams with the forensic detail of a surgeon planning an incision. He was teaching her. She listened, her mind sharp, committing the angles and the pressure points to memory. They were a strange pair, the orchardist's daughter and the Apache scout, united by the crime in front of them. A sound split the air. Hoofbeats, high on the rim. Coming fast. Crowther, Rowan breathed, recognizing the heavy gait of the foreman's favorite horse. In an instant, Callion's calm competence became dangerous speed. He did not panic. He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron, but not rough, and pulled her. Down, now. He didn't pull her toward the rocks he'd come from. He pulled her sideways, into the dense, thorny shadow of a massive cholla cactus that leaned out over the wash. It was the only cover on this side. They flattened themselves against the gravel, pressing into the meager shade, the spines of the cactus looming inches from their faces. Rowan's heart felt like it would tear through her ribs. She held her breath. Junko had vanished, flattened himself into a depression in the rocks 20 yards away. A silent, disciplined shadow. The riders stopped directly above them on the ravine's edge. 3 of them. Rowan could smell their sweat and the dust from their horses. See, a rough voice. Silas Crowther, Breyer's foreman. Dry as a bone. That damn plug is holding better than I thought. Still don't like it, said another voice, thin and nervous. Pike said that Hale girl was asking questions, poking around. Let her, Silas sneered. She pokes around here. She'll get poked. Breyer wants her quiet. Married or buried. He don't care which. Just quiet. Rowan's blood went cold. She was pressed so tightly against Callion she could feel the solid, steady rhythm of his breathing. It was slow, measured. While her own blood was roaring in her ears, his was calm. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the faint, clean scent of sage and leather that clung to him. She risked a glance at him. He was motionless, his eyes closed. Listening. His lips moved slightly. He was counting. She heard the low, guttural sounds, soft as creek gravel, steady as a metronome. He was counting the riders in Apache, cataloging their voices, their positions. He was a weapon at rest. The man above hawked and spat. The saliva landed a foot from Rowan's head, splattering on the hot rock. She flinched, her shoulder brushing Callion's chest. His hand moved, his fingers brushing her wrist. A silent command to remain still. Nothing here, Silas said finally. Let's ride. We'll check the south ridge. The sound of hooves turning, of horses snorting, and then the heavy thudding as they rode away. Neither of them moved. Rowan counted to 100, her heart still aching. Callion waited longer. The silence of the ravine settled back in, heavy and absolute. Finally, he moved, rising to his feet in one fluid motion. He offered her a hand. She took it. His palm was hard, calloused and warm. He pulled her up easily. The space between them was charged. They had shared breath, shared danger. They had heard the threat together. He turned to leave. His duty as a guide apparently over. He was already melting back toward the cleft in the rocks. Wait, Rowan said. He paused, his back to her. When? She asked. He looked over his shoulder. This is not your fight. This is mine. They took my sister. They took my water, she countered, her voice low and fierce. They threatened my life. It is my fight, too. When... He looked at her, the slight, rare curve returning to his mouth. He reached into a pouch at his belt and tossed her something. It landed softly in the dust at her feet, a small, tight coil of rawhide. You'll need both hands free before this ends. Callie and Windrunner said, and then he was gone. He did not walk away. He simply was not there anymore. Rowan stood alone in the ravine, the coiled rawhide in her hand, the dam looming in front of her like a tombstone. The adobe walls of the Salt Cedar Mission offered a coolness that felt less like relief and more like the air from a cellar. The heat outside was a physical weight, pressing the life from Juniper Crossing. But inside the mission, the silence was older and heavier. Father Alonzo Vega, a small man whose black cassock seemed perpetually dusted with the pale powder of the territory, wiped the rim of a tin cup. He and Rowan stood near the mission's deep, stone-lined well, built by monks 100 years before. "The water is wrong," Father Vega said, his voice quiet, not wanting the words to travel. He pushed the cup toward her. Rowan drank. The water was cold, but it carried a vile, metallic tang. It was brackish, spoiled. "It started 3 weeks ago," he continued, his eyes tracing the adobe bricks as if they were a confessor. "The day after Mr. Breyer's surveyors drove their stakes up by the springs. They said they were mapping for the railroad. The next morning, our water tasted of this, of rust and finality. He's poisoning the town's well just as surely as he's drying up my creek," Rowan said, her voice low and hard. She set the cup down. "And you, Father, will you speak of this on Sunday?" Father Vega looked into the dark water of the well. "I am a man who tends to souls. Rowan, Magnus Breyer, tends to the territory. He brings progress. He funds the new roof for this chapel. The bishop in Tucson speaks very highly of his endeavors. Even if those endeavors poison the house of God." The priest met her gaze. The deep, weary sadness in his eyes was answer enough. He was a good man trapped in a rotten structure, and he knew it. "I will pray for rain," he whispered. "Prayer won't stop him." Rowan turned and left the mission, the smell of the corrupted water coating the back of her throat. She rode back to the Hale orchard, the silence of the dead trees accusing her. When she entered the dog-run kitchen, the air was thick with the sharp smell of vinegar and the dry, suffocating scent of lye soap. Aunt Mavis Cormack was sitting in the parlor, a room kept dark to fight the heat. She was darning a feed sack, her stitches small and angry. Mavis was all vinegar and hymns. A woman dried out by the sun and a harsh faith. "You were in town," Mavis stated. It was not a question. "I spoke with Father Vega. The mission well is brackish." "Of course it is." Mavis snapped the thread with her teeth. "The world is hard. It tests us, and you are failing the test." Failing. Rowan stopped, her hands, still grimy from the ravine, clenching at her sides. "You have a solution. A wealthy, powerful man wishes to save this land. He wishes to make you his wife, and you, in your pride, would rather watch your father's legacy turn to kindling than accept a hand offered in kindness. It is not kindness, Aunt. It is a threat. He stole our water. He manufactures the crisis that he then offers to solve. And—" Mavis looked up, her eyes bright and hard as obsidian chips. "So, he is a smart man. So he knows the value of what he wants. Do you think your father built this place with soft hands and a pure heart? He fought, he took, and he held. Now it is your turn to hold it. A lady, Rowan, can endure for her people. A woman can do what must be done. He is offering survival. Take it, wear the rope he offers, and teach yourself to call it pearls." The sound of an expensive carriage arriving cut the argument short. It was a sound so alien to the dusty poverty of the orchard that it felt like a gunshot. Rowan stepped onto the porch. Junko let out a low growl from beneath the floorboards. Magnus Breyer was stepping down from a gleaming black buggy. He was immaculate, in a land defined by dust and sweat. He wore a tailored black broadcloth coat. A heavy silver watch chain gleamed against his vest. He looked cool, untouched. He smelled faintly of bay rum and money. And behind him, like a tame wolf on a short leash, was Sheriff Ephraim Pike. "Miss Hale," Breyer said, removing his hat. His smile was thin, practiced, and owned everything it looked at. "Aunt Mavis, forgive the intrusion. I come on a matter of some urgency." Aunt Mavis moved to stand beside Rowan, her expression shifting to one of strained welcome. "Mr. Breyer, a pleasure. I was just reviewing the territorial bank records from Prescott," Breyer said, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. "Your father, rest his soul, was heavily leveraged. These notes—" He pulled a sheaf of papers from his inside pocket. "They are coming due. The drought, of course, has made payment impossible." Rowan's blood ran cold. "You know why?" Breyer's smile did not waver. "I know only what the bank knows, that this property is in default, or rather, it will be." He stepped closer, offering the papers. "I have, however, prepared an alternative, a gift, if you will." Rowan took the papers. Her eyes scanned the legal text. It was an offer of a water stipend, a guaranteed allotment to be piped in from the railroad's own supply, enough to save the remaining trees. It was also an immediate, private assumption of the banknotes by Magnus Breyer himself. "In exchange," Rowan said, her voice flat. "In exchange," Magnus said smoothly. "For an alliance, a partnership to join our interests, a fast wedding, Miss Hale, to protect you, and this land from foreclosure." Aunt Mavis let out a small, sharp breath of victory. "The papers seem quite proper," Sheriff Pike offered, his hand resting on his gun belt. He stepped forward, pointing a thick finger at the bottom of the document. "C-stamped with a territorial seal. All quite proper." Rowan looked at the seal. The blue ink was bright, embossed onto the paper. It looked freshly sticky, as if the stamp had been applied in the carriage on the ride over. This was the civic rot Father Vega feared. Here on her porch. "This is not a proposal," Rowan said, handing the papers back. "This is a foreclosure notice dressed in a tuxedo." Breyer's eyes hardened, the veneer of charm evaporating. "It is the only offer you will receive. The bank will move to auction this land by the end of the week." "I need time," Rowan said, her mind racing, scrambling for purchase. She thought of Callian, of the dam. "A week. Give me 1 week." Magnus Breyer looked at the dead trees, then back at her. He smiled, and the thin expression was colder than the mission well. "The bank is not as patient as I am, and I find my patience wearing thin. You have 2 days. You will give me your answer on Sunday, at the church, or the foreclosure advances Monday morning. I trust you will make the right choice for your family." He tipped his hat, turned, and climbed back into his buggy. Pike gave her a last, heavy-lidded look, a look that said, "I follow the money," and mounted his horse. They left in a cloud of dust that settled back onto the porch, coating Rowan's skin. She stood there, vibrating with a rage so cold it felt like fear. She was trapped, duty versus dignity. The silk noose was no longer an offer, it was a sentence. She stayed on the porch as the sun died, the sky turning a deep, bruised purple. The heat of the day bled out of the ground, and the desert air turned cool. She was running her hands along the rough-hewn porch rail. Her father's work, feeling the splinters. Her fingers stopped. It was not a splinter. It was a carving, fresh against the old wood. It had not been there this morning. It was not letters. It was a set of symbols, cut clean and deep with a sharp knife. A horizontal line, stacked like stones, the dam. Below it, a single, wavy markwater, and next to it, a small, sharp crescent, pointing down a knife, or a wedge, bleeding the dam. Below that, a simple clear carving of a flat-topped mesa with a streak of red ochre painted butte. The dam bleeds tonight. Meet at painted butte. Callian. The choice, which seconds ago had seemed impossible, clarified into a single, terrifying point of light. It was the choice between 2 deaths. One was slow, suffocating, and legal. The other was fast, dangerous, and right. Rowan's heart, which had been a cold stone in her chest, began to thud. It sounded like hoofbeats in her throat. She turned and walked, not ran, to the small tack room beside the barn. Her hands were steady as she lifted the heavy saddle onto Blue Smoke's back. The horse snorted. Sensing the urgency, Rowan checked the cinch, her movements economical, her mind clear. She slipped the rawhide coil Callian had given her through her belt and settled her father's rifle into the scabbard. Junko appeared at her heel, a silent shadow. His head up, his ears pricked. He knew. She led the horse quietly past the house, keeping to the soft earth of the dead orchard. As she prepared to mount, she glanced back at the parlor window. A single flame flickered to life. Aunt Mavis Cormack was standing there, a prayer candle in her hand. She had spied her leaving. She did not wave. She did not call out. She simply stood, a dark silhouette against the faint light, watching the last hope of her family ride out into the darkness. Rowan could almost hear the woman's dry, brittle whisper, a prayer for the stubborn child who refused to take a rope she could wear like pearls. The moon was a cold plate, shearing the tops off the mesas and flooding Raven's Wash with a light so bright it felt brittle. It made the pale granite gleam and turned the shadows into pools of ink. Rowan moved down the scree slope, her boots sinking into the loose rock. The rawhide lariat coiled and heavy at her hip. The air was dead, holding the acrid tang of the pitch. He was there, exactly as she knew he would be. Callian Windrunner's silhouette was trimmed sharp against the slate-gray sky, a shape of pure intent. He was not waiting. His hands were already in the stonework, his shoulder braced, a long steel pry bar wedged deep into the seam he had shown her. He moved with a focused, desperate rhythm, and did not turn as she approached. He had heard every step she took. "You are quiet, for a rancher," he said, his voice a low vibration against the stone. He grunted, putting his weight into the bar. The rock did not move. "You are loud, for a shadow," she answered, dropping her mallet and a set of steel wedges to the ground. The clatter seemed to echo for miles. He stopped, turning to look at her. "We need the hollow point, where the stone is bluffing." He took her hand. His palm was hard, dry, and hot. He placed it flat against the keystone, his own hand covering hers, pressing it to the granite. The rock was cold and sticky with pitch. "Close your eyes," he commanded. His voice was low, close to her ear, and she felt the vibration of it as much as she heard it. "Listen." Rowan closed her eyes, shutting out the accusing moonlight. She felt nothing but cold stone. "I hear nothing. You are listening for sound. Listen for the space." His hand pressed hers harder. "The river is on the other side. It is heavy. It is pushing. Feel where the stone is weakest. Match your breath to the rhythm. Feel it." She focused, tuning out the night, the fear, the image of Briar's smug face. She slowed her breathing, matching the slow, powerful cadence of Callian's, and then she felt it, a vibration. It was not a sound. It was a deep, resonant thrum, a hollowness, as if the rock itself was a drum. The river was on the other side, and it was alive. "There," she breathed, her fingers splaying, tracing the empty space she could feel through the granite. "It's hollow. Here." His voice was grim with approval. He jammed the flat head of the lever deep into the seam she had found. He handed her the heavy mallet and one of the steel wedges. "Set this just below the bar." She placed the sharp steel wedge into the crack. "Now strike," he said, not with rage, with weight. 1, 2, 3, strike. They found a rhythm in the silence, a desperate, shared work. Rowan swung the mallet. The metal-on-metal clang was a shock, a gunshot in the night. Callian put his entire lean weight onto the lever, his muscles cording. Strike, lever, brace. Strike, lever, brace. Sweat ran cold down Rowan's back. Her palms stung, the blisters from the orchard breaking against the mallet's handle. The stone was unmoving. It was a tomb. Again, Callian grunted, his feet sliding slightly in the gravel. Rowan swung, putting all her fear and rage into the blow. The wedge bit deeper. A sound answered, a thin, high whine, like a wire drawn taut in the wind. "It's moving," she gasped. "It is only air." He reset the pry bar, finding a new angle. Again. She struck. The whine became a sharp, high-pitched singing, a thread of water, black as ink in the moonlight, snaked from the seam and splashed onto her boot. It was impossibly cold. "It's alive," she whispered, a fierce, wild joy rising in her chest. "It's angry," Callian replied. He put his shoulder to the lever and heaved. The stone groaned. "Now, Rowan. Now." Rowan lifted the mallet high and brought it down with every ounce of strength she possessed. The wedge vanished into the rock. The sound changed instantly. The singing stopped. It was replaced by a low, powerful hammering, as if a giant was beating on the other side of the dam, demanding release. The ground vibrated. The thread of water became a gush, bursting out with a coughing roar. The pressure was returning to its rightful bed. The dam was bleeding. "What in God's name?" The shout was high, from the rim. Torches! 4 of them. Dirty orange flares against the clean moonlight. Silas Crowther's voice barked an order. Rowan's blood froze. She grabbed for her rifle, leaning it against the rock. Callian's hand shot out, grabbing her arm. "No, stay! They'll see us, the light, the water." "The light is theirs," he said, his voice flat. "The dark is ours. Down in the wash," a voice yelled. "I heard steel." The torches began to move, picking a clumsy path down the scree slope. The men were shadows, silhouetted against their own light. Callian moved, but not to run. He knelt, scooping a double handful of fine, pale dust and alkali ash from the dry part of the wash. He watched the slight breeze, the cold draft coming off the new water. He waited. The men were clustered, halfway down, their torches held high, illuminating the rock face. Then, with a powerful, fluid motion, Callian stood and blew the ash from his palms, throwing it up into the air, into the path of the wind. The wind stole the light. The fine, choking cloud drifted directly into the torches. The flames were not extinguished, but they were snuffed, their light scattered and thrown back. For the men on the slope, their world dissolved into a cloud of blinding, gray dust. They choked, cursed, and staggered, their vision gone. For Rowan and Callian, looking up, the effect was breathtaking. The moon, the torches, the canyon walls all vanished. For one perfect, impossible instant, the sky was a deep, silent cave of stars. "Run," Callian said. They did not go back the way she had come. He grabbed her hand and pulled her down the wash, toward a thick tangle of tamarisk and shadow where the canyon narrowed. Shouts, and a single, panicked gunshot echoed behind them. They burst through the brittle branches into a small clearing. The wash forked here, the new water already cutting a deep, fast channel in the rock. The safe bank was 12 feet away, a gap too wide to jump. A massive, dead cottonwood lay half across it, its trunk slick with new moisture. Callian skidded to a stop, seeing the trap. "This way!" "No!" Rowan panted. "This way!" She was already uncoiling the rawhide lariat from her hip. Her father had taught her this. She swung the loop twice, a whistling song in the air, and cast it. The loop snaked out and settled perfectly over a jutting, broken branch on the cottonwood's root ball on the far side. She yanked it tight, the hemp biting into the wood. "Go. You first. You're lighter. Test it." She shoved him toward the rope. He gave her a look in the dim light, a flash of stunned, wild amusement. And then he was moving. He grabbed the lariat, ran 2 steps, and swung across the gap with a cat's economy, landing silent as smoke. "Come," he called, his voice low. Rowan grabbed the rope, backed up, and ran. She launched herself into the air, swinging out over the dark, churning water. Thwack! A sharp, violent tear. She cried out, not in pain, but in shock. An arrow. It had come from the darkness behind her. It had missed her body, but pinned the thick canvas of her sleeve, and the rope itself, to the cottonwood trunk she was swinging toward. She was stuck, dangling, her feet scrambling for purchase on the wet rock, 10 feet above the cut. A rough laugh echoed from the tamarisk. "Got the girl. Silas got her pinned." Before the man could finish his sentence, Callian was moving. He balanced on the slick log, a living part of the shadow. His knife, a long, dark blade, flashed once in the moonlight. He didn't try to pull the arrow out. He grabbed the vibrating shaft, set his blade against it, and snapped it clean with the heel of his hand. Rowan was free. She fell, sliding down the rock face. His palm found her wrist. It was hot, solid, and grounding. He hauled her up, pulling her bodily onto the safe bank, sheltering her with his own body. "Can you run?" he demanded. "It's just my sleeve," she panted, her arm burning from the impact. They scrambled up the higher rock, finding cover in a cluster of boulders. They were safe, for the moment. "They're coming across the log," Rowan whispered, seeing the torches move. "Let them," Callian said. He was not looking at the men. He was looking back up the ravine, listening. A new sound began. It was not the hammering from before. It was a groan, a deep, tectonic shifting, the sound of the earth itself giving up. Below them, the dam, weakened by the bleed, stressed by the hammer, and pushed by a river that had tasted freedom, surrendered. It did not explode, it coughed. A huge, central section of the stacked stone plug simply dissolved. The wall sagged, and then the river shouldered through. It came not as a gush, but as a body. A solid, 10-foot wall of churning, muddy, glorious water. It hit the dry wash with a roar that shook the teeth in their skulls. It was a brown, thundering beast, carrying boulders and debris, roaring as it reclaimed its home. The cottonwood log they had just crossed was swept away like a twig. The men on it, Silas Crowther included, screamed. Their screams were thin, lost in the noise. The water, muddy and righteous, swallowed their torches and their shouts. Rowan and Callian stood on the high rock, the cold spray hitting their faces. The roar of the freed river filled the world. In the sudden, overwhelming noise, Rowan Hale, covered in mud, her sleeve pinned with a broken arrow, her father's legacy in ashes, began to laugh. It was a wet, breathless, half-mad sound of pure, terrified relief. Callian looked at her. The moonlight caught the water on her face, tracking like tears. His mouth curved. It was not the slight tip of amusement from before. It was a real, sharp, fierce curve. The river had chosen a side. The roar of the freed river was a physical thing, a sound that shook their bones and filled the canyon. It was the sound of a god waking up. They climbed, scrambling up the rock face, moving away from the churning chaos. The adrenaline was a fire in their veins, making their soaked limbs feel light. Above them, the sky, which had promised and failed for so many weeks, finally broke. The false thunderhead tore open. Rain began to fall. It was not a gentle, cleansing rain. It was a hard, cold, driving Arizona deluge, lashing down in sheets that turned the granite slick and treacherous. The sky was unloading its full, pent-up fury. "This way!" Callian shouted over the combined roar of the river and the new storm. Higher, he knew the land, every fold and crease. He led her on a path that was not a path, a narrow game trail that wound upward, away from the wash, into the high country rock. They ran, soaked to the skin in seconds, their boots heavy with mud, the cold wind whipping Rowan's hair across her face. They were running on pure, sharp-edged adrenaline. After what felt like an hour, when Rowan's lungs were burning and her legs felt like lead, he stopped. He pulled her into the lee of a large boulder, into a small, dark space. It was a structure, barely, an old line shack, built by telegraph men years ago and long since forgotten. It was little more than a pile of rocks and a few rough-hewn planks, with a rusted tin roof. It smelled of sage, pack rat nests, and old, cold smoke, but it was dry. They fell inside, collapsing onto the dirt floor, gasping for air. The rain hammered on the tin roof, a frantic, deafening drumming, like 100 hooves galloping overhead. The adrenaline began to fade. The cold seeped in. Rowan looked down at her hands. They were trembling, violently. The cuts from the mallet were caked with mud and pitch, and her arm was a dull, heavy throb. The broken shaft of the arrow was still snagged in her canvas sleeve, which was dark and stiff with her own blood. Callian watched her, his breath still ragged. He did not speak. He moved to the small, crude fireplace, built of river stone. He found a few dry sticks of tamarisk left by the last occupant, and with his flint and steel, he coaxed a small, struggling flame to life. The light was weak, but it was light. He found a rusty tin pot, took it outside, and filled it with the pouring rain, then set it on the stones to boil. He turned to her. His face was unreadable in the flickering light. He held out his knife, handle first. Rowan just looked at him, confused, her teeth chattering. "Your sleeve," he said, his voice quiet. She nodded, unable to speak. She held out her arm. He did not touch her skin. He carefully, precisely, cut the sleeve away, the keen blade slicing the thick, wet canvas. The arrow graze was ugly, a deep, raw score in the flesh of her forearm, bleeding sluggishly. Her hands were shaking so hard she tucked them under her arms. Callian waited for the water to boil. He tore a clean strip from the hem of his own shirt. He dipped it in the steaming water, wringing it out. He knelt in front of her. He did not grab her arm. He held the hot, wet cloth near the wound, his eyes on hers. He waited. It was a question. "Rowan." She gave a single, sharp nod. He began to clean the wound. His touch was not gentle, but it was careful and firm and devastatingly precise. It stung, a clean, sharp fire, and Rowan hissed, but she did not pull away. He cleaned every grain of dirt, every speck of pitch. His focus was absolute, as if this small patch of wounded skin was the only thing that mattered in the world. When he was done, he bound the arm with the dry part of the cloth strip, pulling the knot tight with his teeth. The trembling began to ease. The silence in the shack was thick, broken only by the drumming rain and the crackle of the small fire, the shared danger. The frantic run had burned away everything but the essential. She was watching his face as he worked, the lines carved around his eyes, the set of his mouth. Her hand, the one that was not trembling, lifted. It moved on its own, a gesture born of a strange, new intimacy. She slowly, lightly, traced a faint white scar that ran from the corner of his jaw into his hairline. He froze. He did not pull away, but his dark eyes lifted to meet hers. The ghost of his rare smile touched his mouth. "My cousin," he said, his voice low, the sound strange in the quiet room. "I was 8, maybe 9. I bragged I could ride my father's pony backward. The pony did not agree. The ground was hard. My pride was harder." The story was so simple, so human. It was a gift. A small laugh escaped Rowan, a sound of pure surprise. The laugh faded, and the gravity of the night rushed back in. "The men at the dam," she said, her voice dropping. "Silas Crowther. They had an arrow, not a rifle." Callian's expression hardened, the brief lightness gone, replaced by a cold anger. "They are butchers. They are not warriors. What Briar did to Taya's camp. They were driven from the springs, their lodges burned, their blankets taken. Not for war, for paper." He said the word as if it were poison. "He had soldiers with him, to make it legal. They said my sister was a trespasser on her own land. He stole her life and called it progress." Rowan's throat tightened. She knew that word. She knew that kind of violence. "He came to my home this afternoon. He offered me a water stipend to save my land." Her voice was bitter, mimicking Briar's smooth tone. "In exchange for a fast wedding, Sunday, he traps you and then calls the bars of the cage a gift of mercy. He wants to barter for me, like I am a dry parcel of land, like your sister." The silence that followed this was absolute. It was a shared, profound understanding. They were two people, cornered by the same man, the same system. The rain on the roof, as if sensing the change, began to hush. The furious drumming eased, softening to a steady, quiet rhythm. They were just two people, soaked and tired, sitting on a dirt floor, in a small, dark room, lit by the low, warm fire. And they were looking at each other, not as strangers, not as an orchardist and a scout, but as two people who had just seen the truth in each other. He was sitting on his heels. She was cross-legged. He leaned forward, just an inch. She leaned forward to meet him. Without a word, their foreheads came to rest together. It was a gesture of pure, unadorned comfort, an anchor in the storm. Their breaths synced. The air shared between them. The silence said more than words ever could. "I see you. I am not mad. You are not alone. I am not alone." They stayed that way for a long time. Just breathing. He pulled back, just enough to see her face in the dim firelight. His eyes were dark, clear. He was asking. There was no demand, no expectation, no pressure. It was the cleanest, most honest question she had ever been asked. May I Rowan's breath hitched. This was not Breyer's suffocating contract. This was not Pike's corrupt dismissal. This was real. She answered him, not with a word. She let out a small, fierce, shaky breath. It was a yes. His hand, which had been resting on his knee, moved. It was slow, patient. He laid his palm open against her spine, over the wet, rough canvas of her shirt. The touch was careful. It did not grab. It did not pull. It invited, and it was warm. It grounded her, stopped the last of the trembling. He drew her in. Their first kiss was slow. It was hesitant, tasting of rain and wood smoke and the iron-red mud of the canyon. It was a question, and an answer, and a discovery, all at once. Then it deepened. It became sure. The heat that had been fear and rage and adrenaline braided itself with a relief so profound it ached. This was not a man who took, this was a man who met her, halfway. Her hands, the ones that had been shaking, were steady now. They came up, her fingers tangling in his damp hair, her other hand gripping his shoulder, holding on. His other hand came up to cup her jaw, his calloused thumb brushing the line of her cheek, wiping away a drop of rain. A small, shaky laugh of pure disbelief escaped her, a sound lost between their mouths. He answered it with a low sound of his own, a breath of agreement, and his mouth curved against hers. They parted, just to breathe, just to look at each other, and then came together again. This time with a sureness, a heat that was a promise. Their hands mapped shoulders, hair, the sharp line of a collarbone, the shake of laughter and relief that passed between them. The fire burned low, sinking to embers. The rusty lantern Callian had found and lit in the corner sputtered, its light dimming, casting long, soft silhouettes against the rough-hewn walls. The rain outside eased, becoming a quiet, steady dripping from the gutters. The boots, one pair heavy, one pair moccasins, thudded softly to the floor. There were whispers. There were promises. There was the soft, low sound of heartbeats, and the gentle patter of the rain. Much later, when sleep finally found them, it was a heavy, earned exhaustion. On the narrow, rough-built cot, Rowan's hand remained hooked in the front of Callian's shirt, a grip that held even in sleep. In the near-total darkness, Callian was awake. He stared up at the shadows on the low ceiling, listening to the rain and the sound of her breathing. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile that reached his eyes. It was the smile of a man who had been walking alone in the desert for a very long time, and had just found his compass. Morning brought a sky the color of old copper, bruised and heavy. The air, washed clean by the deluge, felt thin and electric. Rowan and Callian stood on the high ridge, looking down. The silence of the dawn was broken by a new, living sound, the deep-throated murmur of the river. It was no longer a dry wash. It was a muscular, churning body of water, brown and thick with reclaimed earth, carving its old path through the canyon. The breach in the dam was a ragged, open mouth, grinning. Even from this distance, Rowan could smell it, the sharp, rich scent of wet soil, of life. She imagined the parched roots of her father's orchard, 2 miles distant, drinking for the first time in months. The thought sent a fierce, painful jolt of hope through her. They were both soaked, caked in mud, and moving with a slow, deliberate ache of exhaustion. The night in the line shack had been a suspension of time, a brief, stolen shelter. Now, the reality of their actions settled onto them with the cold light of day. They had won the battle. The war was just beginning. "He will not let this stand," Rowan said, her voice rough. "When he finds out, he knows." Callian said. He was scanning the far ridge, his eyes missing nothing. He knew the moment the water hit his work camp, they will be hunting. "Silas and his men." "Silas," Callian said, his voice flat, "is the river's problem now, or at the bottom of it." He looked at her. "But Briar has more men, and he has the law." He reached inside his wet shirt, into an oilcloth pouch she had not seen. He pulled out a small, dark object, a pocket ledger, its cover stained with mud and pitch. Rowan stared at it. "Where?" "In the tamarisk. When Crowther fell, before the water came." Callian's voice was devoid of pride. It was a statement of fact. A scout takes what is dropped. He was a careless man. He wrote everything down. They opened it. Sitting on the cold granite, the pages were damp. The ink blurred in places, but it was legible. It was a payment book. Silas Crowther had itemized his corruption. Rowan's finger traced the spidery script, her heart a cold drum. Deputy Reeves, $50. For silence on Raven's Wash closure. Sheriff P, $100. For support on Hale probate. Notary Prescott, $50. Expedited sealing. The words were a map of the conspiracy, the rot that had poisoned the mission well, the apathy from the sheriff's office. It was all here, purchased for $200 and a notary's stamp. Hale probate. Rowan whispered, the words leaving a bitter taste. Magnus bragged about that. He told my aunt he'd rescued my father's messy paperwork. He said he was saving us. Callian turned a page, tucked into the back, folded 4 times. Was another document. It was an official-looking addendum to a deed, the ink on the territorial seal bright blue. It granted the Arizona Pacific Railroad broad diversion rights at Raven's Wash, citing a survey from 6 months prior, and at the bottom, a signature. Elias Hale. Rowan's breath stopped. She took the paper from him. She ran her thumb over the signature. A name she had seen every day of her life on feed receipts, on letters, on the family Bible. "This is not his," she said, her voice a low, vibrating wire. "It's not his hand. You're sure?" "My father," she said, her voice shaking with a cold, absolute rage, "made his H with a loop, like this. He was proud of it. This is sharp. It's an imitation, a bad one." She looked up at Callian, her eyes wide with the full, sickening scope of the revelation. "It was all a lie. He didn't find a loophole. He made one. He forged my father's name to steal the water. Then he used the drought he created to call in the banknotes. He built the entire trap." Callian was silent, his jaw tight. He watched her as the pieces clicked into place, as her grief and fear crystallized into something hard, sharp, and righteous. "We have to take this to a marshal," he said. "In Prescott." "No." Rowan refolded the forgery, her movements precise. "We'd never make it. His riders are out. Pike would have us in irons for trespassing and blowing the dam before we got 5 miles. We can't run to the law. The law is his." Then what? Rowan looked south, toward the small, white spire of the Salt Cedar Mission, barely visible in the morning haze. He wants his answer on Sunday, in the church, in front of the whole town. He wants to be seen as the savior. She met Callian's gaze. "He'll get his answer. We won't use a courtroom. Callian, we'll use his stage." They moved at dusk, avoiding the roads. Using the arroyos and ridges Callian knew, they came to the mission from the back, through the small, withered garden. Rowan left Callian in the shadows of the colonnade, a silent promise to wait. She found Father Alonso Vega in the sacristy, lighting a single candle. He turned, startled, and his eyes widened when he saw her, mud-streaked, her arm bound in a bloody rag, her hair wild. She must have looked like a phantom. "My child," he breathed, crossing himself. What has happened?" "The dam is broken. Father," she said, her voice steady. "The water is free. I heard the roar." I thought it was thunder again. He looked past her, into the darkness. "The men who were with Mr. Breyer, they met the river." She stepped forward, placing the pocket ledger and the forged addendum on his small, polished table. "This is why. This is the truth." Father Vega bent, his spectacles slipping down his nose. He read the entries in the ledger. He saw the name Pike. He saw the line, "Hale Probate." And then he saw the forged signature of Elias Hale, a man he had buried 6 months ago. He sank onto his stool, his face ashen. "This is a great evil." "He poisoned your well, Father," Rowan said, her voice soft but relentless. "He forged my father's name, and on Sunday, he plans to stand in your church, in God's house, and use a threat of foreclosure to force my hand in marriage. He wants to make your church the scene of his victory. Will you allow it? Will you bless a union built on forgery and theft?" The priest's hands trembled. He was a man of peace, a man who feared the power of men like Breyer. He looked from the ledger to the small, unadorned cross on his wall. He thought of the brackish, poisoned water in his own well. "What do you ask of me?" "Rowan," he whispered. "Keep these." She pushed the ledger and the deed toward him. "Keep them in a locked box, on the altar, where the whole town can see it." His eyes widened in fear. "On the altar, in sight of God, and on Sunday," Rowan said. "Ring the bell early, ring it loud, ring it until every soul in Juniper Crossing comes to see what's wrong, not just for service, for a reckoning." Father Vega looked at the ledger, then at Rowan's steady, unblinking eyes. He saw the flint he had prayed for. He picked up the ledger and the forgery. "Mr. Breyer has corrupted the water," he said, his voice gaining a thin, reedy strength. "I will not permit him to corrupt the word." He slid the evidence into the heavy oak altar box and turned the key. "The bell will ring." They spent Saturday hidden in the line shack. It was their fortress. While Callian took long, silent scouting trips around the ridge, Rowan prepared their evidence. She found a clean, bleached flour sack. Using a piece of charcoal from the fire pit, she began to write, her letters large, stark, and angry. Breyer's payments: Sheriff Pike, $100. Hale Probate Dieppe, Reeves, $50. Ravens Wash Notary, $50. Forgery. It was crude, a sign for a gallows, not a courtroom. The truth, she murmured to herself, scaled to be seen from the pews. Callian returned as the copper sun began to bleed into the horizon. He was not breathing hard, but there was a new tension in his shoulders. He carried the fresh scent of pine and wind. "We are being hunted," he said, not as a warning, but as a confirmation. "How many?" "2, on the High Ridge Trail. They are watching the orchard and the road to town. One has a cavalry cut. They are not drifters. They are professionals. They are waiting for us to return home." Rowan's hand went to her throat, on a new leather thong. She wore the broken Thunderbird charm. She had found it in her pocket, and now it rested against her skin. It was Taya's. It was a reminder of what happened to those who were simply in the way. The glint of a cavalry cut. The charm felt warm. A silent warning. She had to go back to the orchard. Just once. For clean clothes for Sunday. For food. She could not face the town looking like a wraith. She went at the deepest point of dusk. Callian 100 yards behind her. A ghost in the mesquite. She slipped into the dark. Silent house. It felt cold. Abandoned. A single candle sputtered to life in the kitchen. Aunt Mavis stood there, a bonnet on her head and a carpetbag at her feet. She was leaving. She saw Rowan, and her face, already a mask of grim resignation, hardened. "So," she whispered, her voice dry as a corn husk. "You're alive. The town is in an uproar. The dam is gone. Silas Crowther and his men are missing, presumed dead. The water is back. Aunt Mavis. And you're the cause?" She stepped forward, her whisper turning venomous. "You've done this. You've destroyed us. I exposed a thief. You exposed yourself as a fool, as a ruined woman." The words were sharp, meant to cut. You spent the night, alone in the mountains, with him. She jerked her head toward the darkness outside, where she knew Callian was. You've spat in Magnus Breyer's face. You will lose this house. You will lose your name. You will be ruined. Rowan stood still. She looked at the woman who had raised her, a woman so shrunken by fear that she saw salvation in a silk noose. Rowan had felt that noose. She had chosen the arrow and the river instead. She was muddy. She was aching, and she had never been more herself. She picked up a clean, starched white shirt from a press. She looked at her aunt, her voice not loud, but steady. It was as clear and cold and final as the new water running in the wash. Then let me be ruined and right. She turned and walked out of the house, leaving her aunt alone in the flickering candlelight, and did not look back. Sunday stacked clouds over Juniper Crossing, heavy and gray as wet wool. The sky was a low ceiling, pressing the heat and the tension down onto the town. Then the bell of Salt Cedar Mission began to toll. It was not the gentle, rhythmic call to worship. It was early by at least an hour, and it was frantic, a hard, clanging alarm that cracked the humid air. Clang, 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 a sound that meant fire, or flood, or war. People streamed from their houses, bonnets tied in a hurry, dusters unbuttoned. They moved toward the church not with piety, but with a hungry, nervous energy. The rumors of the last 36 hours had been wild. The river was back. Silas Crowther and his crew were gone. Magnus Breyer was furious. And Rowan Hale, who was supposed to be ruined, had been seen at the Hale house, clean and quiet. Just before dawn, the pews filled. The air grew thick with the smell of damp wool, sweat, and cheap soap, all underscored by the faint, metallic tang of the brackish water in the font. The townsfolk murmured, their heads together, a hive of nervous speculation. Then, the murmuring hushed. Magnus Breyer arrived. He did not come alone. He strode down the center aisle, his boots striking the planks with an owner's confidence. At his side, his silver badge gleaming, was Sheriff Ephraim Pike, his hand resting on his pistol grip, his eyes heavy and flat. But it was the third man who made the crowd gasp. He was a stranger, thin and sour, in a black suit that was too hot for the weather. He carried a leather satchel and a look of absolute, portable authority. "It's Judge Thorne," a man whispered from the back. "A territorial judge, from Prescott." Breyer was not here to pray. He was here to convene court. He had brought his own portable righteousness, plated in nickel and sealed by the territory. He was here to finalize the foreclosure, to put the last legal stamp on his victory. He took his seat in the front pew, Pike standing beside him like a guard, the judge sitting with his satchel on his lap, looking annoyed. The bell finally stopped. The silence that fell was absolute. Father Alonzo Vega stepped up to the chancel. He looked small, his skin as pale as his vestments. He opened his service book, his hands trembling slightly. "My children," he began, his voice thin, "we gather today in a time of confusion. We seek clarity. We seek truth." He looked out over the packed pews, his gaze landing on the hard, expectant face of Magnus Breyer. The priest's gaze did not waver. "And the truth," he said, his voice gaining a reedy strength, "must be seen, in the light, in God's house." He closed the book. He turned and stepped aside, leaving the chancel empty. Every head turned. Rowan Hale was walking up the aisle. She was not walking like a woman ruined. She was not walking like a bride. She was walking like an executioner. She wore her clean white shirt and canvas trousers, her face scrubbed, her damp hair tied back. Her chin was level. The broken Thunderbird charm rested at her throat, at her heel. So quiet, he seemed a part of her shadow. Was Junko? The dog did not look left or right. His head was up, his eyes fixed forward, a silent, disciplined escort. In one hand, Rowan carried the muddy, water-stained pocket ledger. In the other, she carried the folded, charcoal-marked flour sack. A low, sharp intake of breath. A gasp crackled through the pews. This was not a wedding. This was a confrontation. At the rear of the church, a shadow detached itself from the wall and moved to stand by the heavy oak doors. It was Callion Windrunner. He was not there for the service. His eyes swept the room, noting the windows, the number of men near Briar, the position of the judge. He was counting exits. He was a soldier and a shepherd, guarding his flock of one. Rowan reached the chancel. Junko lay down at her feet, his head on his paws, watching the crowd. She did not address the priest. She turned and faced the pews. She faced the town. She faced Magnus Briar. "You came here for an answer, Mr. Briar," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear and cold, and it carried to the back wall. "I am here to give it." She unfolded the flour sack and held it high for all to see. Briar's payments. Sheriff Pike, $100. Pike's hand tightened on his gun. His face went slick with sweat. "She's lying," he barked. "Am I?" Rowan's voice cut through his. She held up the pocket ledger. Silas Crowther's own hand. He wrote it down. $100 for support on Hale probate. The pews erupted in a roar of murmurs. "She has no proof." Briar snapped, rising to his feet, his face a mask of controlled fury. "I have this," Rowan said. She pulled the folded addendum from her pocket. "A forgery, my father's name, forged on a deed, giving you the right to the water you stole. This is the probate Sheriff Pike supported." She laid it on the altar rail. "And I have this, Deputy Reeves, $50 for silence on Raven's wash closure. And a notary in Prescott, $50, expedited sealing." She looked at the townsfolk, her eyes finding the ranchers whose herds were thin, the women whose gardens had died. "He did not just steal my water. He stole your water. He built a dam of stones and a dam of bribes. He poisoned the mission well, and when his drought had bled us dry, he came to my home, with the sheriff at his side, and offered to save me, in exchange for my land, my name, and my silence. This is madness," the traveling judge blustered, standing up. "This is not a court of law. This is slander, Sheriff. Arrest this woman for contempt." Pike moved. He was red-faced, his reputation disintegrating in front of the entire town. He was not going to arrest her. He was going to silence her. He lunged for the altar, his hand outstretched, not for handcuffs, but for the ledger. "Give me that. Evidence stays where all can see." Callion's voice cut the aisle like a knife. It was deep, cold, and held the absolute authority of a man who feared nothing in the room. Pike froze, his hand inches from the ledger. He turned, his eyes wide, searching for the source of the voice. In that second of hesitation, another man moved. He burst from a side pew, a figure caked in dried mud and river slime, his face a mask of raw hatred. It was Silas Crowther. He was not dead. He was bruised, his arm was broken, and he had survived the river. He lunged, not for the ledger, but for Rowan. You bitch." He never reached her. Junko's bark detonated the hush. It was not a warning. It was an attack. The dog, a 70-pound shadow of black fury, launched himself from the chancel floor and met Crowther in mid-air. The church exploded into chaos. Junko's snarls were lost as men shouted. Women screamed, and pews collided. A fistfight broke out as a rancher shoved Sheriff Pike, who stumbled back into Briar. The ledger and the forged deed were knocked from the rail, skidding across the polished wood. Coming to rest beneath the altar. "Order," the judge bellowed, his voice cracking. "Order, I demand order." Magnus Briar, who had been momentarily knocked off balance, straightened his coat. He watched the brawl, the screaming, the dog fight, and he smirked. This was good. This was perfect. This was a hysterical woman, a savage dog, and a mob. His judge was here. The law was on his side. He had won. "Sheriff," Briar commanded, his voice slicing through the noise. "Stop this, arrest that man." He pointed at Callion. "Arrest the girl." "And shoot that damn dog." Pike, his face bloody from a rancher's punch, finally drew his pistol. He raised it, aiming it at Junko, who was locked onto Crowther's arm. "I would not—" "Sheriff." The voice was Father Vega's. He had not moved. He stood by the altar, his face serene. In his hand, he held the locked oak altar box. With his other hand, he produced a new document. Not the ledger, not the forgery. It was a crisp, white envelope, sealed with the dark blue wax of the Territorial Engineering Office. "I took the liberty," Father Vega said, his voice quiet but carrying in a sudden lull, "of using the telegraph after Miss Hale first showed me the corrupted water. I sent a wire to the chief water engineer in Prescott. I received this reply by courier this morning." The judge, who had been blustering about contempt, stopped. He stared at the blue wax seal. That was not a seal he could buy. Or bully. What does it say?" the judge stammered. "It says," Father Vega said, "that any damming of a public arterial like Raven's Wash, without public review, is illegal. It says all prior deeds are subordinate to public water rights. It voids the addendum, forged or not. And it recommends the immediate arrest of Magnus Breyer." The judge blanched. His face went from red to a sickly, pale white. The pews, silent for a moment, erupted in a new sound, a low, dangerous murmur. It was the sound of bees, of a hive turning. Magnus Breyer looked at the judge's white face. He looked at Pike, who was staring, dumbfounded, at the letter. He looked at Rowan, who stood tall and righteous on the chancel, and he looked at the crowd, at the furious, betrayed faces of the townspeople. The smirk was gone. The legal trap had failed. The political trap had failed. He bared his teeth. He had one card left. He chose violence. His hand dipped inside his tailored black coat. Magnus Breyer's hand, frozen inside his coat, never completed its draw. A sound, or rather a sudden lack of it, sucked the breath from the room. The frantic shouting, the dogs snarling, Pike's bellowing, all of it was choked off by a violent, instantaneous drop in pressure. The candle flames on the altar did not flicker. They bent sideways, reaching toward the back of the church as if drawn by a vacuum. And then the church doors exploded inward. They did not swing open. They were ripped from their heavy, cast-iron hinges and thrown against the adobe walls with the force of a cannonade, a solid, concussive blast of wind, cold and sharp with the smell of ozone, tore down the aisle. Thunder cracked at the exact same instant, a deafening, splitting sound that seemed to come from inside their own skulls. Plaster dust rained down from the vibrating rafters. The hot, suffocating air of the church was instantly purged, replaced by cold, driving rain in a rectangle of pure, violent, white daylight. Framed in that doorway, a silhouette against the storm, stood Callian Windrunner. This was not the quiet scout who had stood in the shadows. This was a man who seemed to be a part of the storm itself. His hair was plastered wild to his skull, his shirt torn at the shoulder, rainwater streaming from him, pooling in the mud at his feet. He was a figure of elemental justice, and his eyes, dark and absolute, ignored the chaos, the guns, the judge. They were fixed on only one person, Rowan. The pews were frozen. Every man and woman was paralyzed, staring at this apparition. Callian took one heavy step onto the planks. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, resonant roll of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building, a sound that filled the rafters and vibrated in their chests. "I object to this wedding." The words were an absurdity. There was no wedding, but the declaration was absolute. It was a claim. The silence that followed was total. Rowan's heart, which had been a cold fist of dread, leaped. It was not a flutter. It was a physical jolt, a painful, powerful leap toward him. He had come. Magnus Breyer was the first to find his voice. His face, already pale with the failure of his legal trap, contorted into a mask of pure, apoplectic rage. This was an affront his world could not process. "Savage!" he roared, his voice cracking. "You dare step into this house, Pike? Arrest this man! Arrest them both! They are murderers! They destroyed my property! They killed my men! Arrest them!" Sheriff Pike, his face bloody from the brawl, his authority shattered, scrambled for his lost control. He leveled his pistol at the figure in the doorway. "Don't move! Apache, you are under arrest!" The townsfolk, who had been a surging, angry mob seconds before, flinched back. They pressed into the pews, away from the aisle, their bodies contracting. They were trapped, suspended between the authority of the sheriff's pistol and the raw, undeniable power of the man in the doorway. They were a flock of sheep, and 2 wolves were in the church, and they did not know which way to run. Callian moved. He did not raise his hands. He did not stop. He did not run. He simply walked, straight down the center aisle, tracking river mud and rainwater onto the polished planks. He ignored the pistol leveled at his chest. He ignored the spittle-flecked commands of Magnus Breyer. He walked, his boots making a heavy, sodden sound, a metronome of intent. He moved through the chaos, through the paralyzed fear of the congregation, his eyes never, for 1 second, leaving Rowan's face. He was a compass needle, and she was true north. He stopped at the foot of the chancel steps. He looked up at her, standing there beside the altar rail, the snarling dog at her feet, the cowering, broken form of Silas Crowther. The chaos. He offered Rowan his hand. It was not a grab to pull her to safety. It was not a gesture of rescue. His hand was open, palm up, the scars and calluses stark. It was asking, not taking. Rowan looked down at that hand, the hand that had pressed hers to the granite of the dam, the hand that had snapped the arrow shaft, the hand whose heat had grounded her in the line shack. She looked from his hand to his face, his calm, wet, resolute face. This was the real choice. This was the real vow. Not the silk noose of Breyer's proposal, but this hand, offered in defiance of law and church and man. She stepped down from the chancel. She placed her palm in his. The clasp was electric. It was a weld, hot and immediate, their fingers locked. It was not a handshake. It was an oath. It was a public, undeniable vow that the entire room, the entire town, could not unsee. In that instant, they ceased to be 2 people. They were one, a single unit of defiance. The action broke the spell. Silas Crowther, his arm still held in Junko's jaws, had been scrambling, his free hand clawing for the pistol at his hip. He finally tore it free. "I'll kill you both," he spat, blood and foam at his lips as he raised the gun. Callian did not release Rowan's hand. He used her as his anchor. In one fluid, devastating pivot, he turned, his body shielding hers, his free hand chopped down, not at the gun, but at Silas's wrist. A wet, sharp snap echoed through the church, cutting through the thunder. The gun clattered harmlessly, skittering under a pew. Crowther's mouth opened in a silent scream, his joint broken. Callian's heel turned, his moccasin striking the side of the foreman's knee. The leg buckled, and Silas collapsed in a heap. His fight gone. It was clean, brutal, and efficient. "Drop it," Pike roared. He was panicked, his target moving. He steadied his aim, his finger tightening on the trigger. His sights leveled on Callian's back. "No!" It was a sharp, furious shriek. Aunt Mavis Cormac. She had been standing in the 3rd pew, her face a mask of gray horror, watching her world, her reputation, her last chance at security, burned to the ground. But when she saw the sheriff, the law, aiming to shoot a man in the back, the man her niece had just chosen before God and everyone, something in the dry, brittle kindling of her soul finally caught fire. She grabbed the heavy oak hymn book cart at the end of the aisle. With a grunt of pure, vinegar-fueled rage, she shoved it. The heavy cart, laden with 100 copies of Songs of Zion, rolled directly into the back of Sheriff Pike's legs. "What?" Pike yelled, his balance gone. He staggered, his arms windmilling. Boom! The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet went wild, tearing upward, burying itself harmlessly in the plaster robes of a statue of St. Joseph. Plaster dust rained down like snow. Pike fell backward over the cart, his pistol sliding across the muddy floor, coming to rest near the font of brackish water. In the ensuing chaos, Father Alonzo Vega moved with a sudden, sharp purpose. He slammed the heavy oak altar box shut, the thud of the lid a sound of finality. He turned the key, locking the ledger, the forgery, and the engineer's letter safely inside. He lifted the box, holding it to his chest like a shield. "This is anarchy," the traveling judge stammered, his face the color of spoiled milk. He was backing away toward the sacristy. "This is not jurisdiction. This is a mob. I will not be party to this." He turned and fled, disappearing behind the altar. The congregation, finally and completely freed from the paralysis of the law, surged forward. They were not murmuring now. They were roaring. "Thief!" a rancher shouted, pointing at Breyer. "Murderer!" a woman screamed. "He killed those men." Magnus Breyer stood alone, his coat open, his hand still frozen on the butt of the small derringer he had been about to draw. He was paralyzed, his face a mask of utter, uncomprehending disbelief. He had lost. Callion's hand tightened on Rowan's. "Now," he said. They began to back toward the door, toward the white, stormy light. Junko, seeing his duty done, detached from Silas and bounded to Rowan's side, a low growl in his chest. Callion and Rowan, with the dog at their heel, reached the threshold. As they stepped out, backing into the cleansing, chaotic rain, lightning veined the sky, a brilliant, jagged crackle. It froze them for an attosecond in a stark, white silhouette against the blackness of the storm. Behind them, in the belfry, the bell, its rope now swinging wildly in the wind, began to toll again. It was not an alarm. It was not a welcome. It was a war drum. The muddy street in front of Salt Cedar Mission was a scene of pure, paralyzed chaos. The bell in the belfry, caught by the wind, tolled its frantic, uneven drumbeat over the town. The congregation, that single unified body of rumor and fear, spilled out onto the planks and into the mud. And then they split. It was not a conscious choice. It was an instinct, a physical sorting of souls. A few men, the dry goods merchant who lived on Breyer's credit. A railroad foreman in his Sunday suit moved instinctively, forming a loose, uncertain barrier in front of Magnus Breyer. They were men shielding the sun, afraid of the darkness it would leave behind. The rest, the vast majority, did not join Rowan and Callion. They did something more profound. They stepped aside. They stepped back, pressing against the market stalls, pulling their children close. They cleared the center of the street. They did not offer help. They simply allowed. They created a path. It was the first passive, powerful act of rebellion. "Get them!" Breyer roared, his voice a wet tear in the wind. He shoved the merchant aside. "Pike, where's Pike? Shoot them now." Sheriff Ephraim Pike, his face a mask of mud and humiliation, hauled himself up from the wreckage of the hymn book cart. He saw his pistol lying in the slick, gray mud near the horse trough. He snatched it. His authority was gone, his reputation in Tet Dieter's, and it made him vicious. "Hail, Windrunner, stop." His voice was a desperate, failing bellow. "In the name of the law, I command you to stop." But Rowan and Callion were already running. Junko, a black streak, ran at their heels, his shoulder brushing Rowan's knee, guarding her flank. They sprinted past the assay office, toward the dark, open maw of the painted butte livery. They were almost there when movement flashed from the alley between the livery and the hardware store. "There!" a voice spat. Silas Crowther, his left arm dangling useless at his side, his face a swollen, purple mask of dried mud and pure hatred, stumbled out to block their path. He was not alone. Two hard-faced drifters from the railroad camp, men who had been waiting outside the church, fanned out behind him, their hands on their belts. They were trapped. Pike and his gun were behind them. Crowther and his men were in front. Callion did not break stride. He did not slow. His eyes darted, not to the men, but to the market stalls they were now passing. A hardware display shovels and picks, and next to it, a grocer's stall, its canvas awning already sagging with rainwater. Stacked precariously on a weak table was a tall, slumping pyramid of late-season persimmons. Callion grabbed Rowan's hand. "Now," he grunted, and yanked her hard to the left. He didn't attack Crowther. He lowered his shoulder and ran directly into the central support pole of the grocer's awning. The rotten wood snapped. The canvas roof tore free, and the table, with its entire load of soft, overripe, sticky fruit, tipped. It was a glorious, comical disaster. The crate shattered. Hundreds of bright orange, mushy persimmons spilled across the wet boardwalk, turning the mud into a treacherous, pulpy slide. Crowther and his men, rushing forward to grab them, hit the slide at a dead run. Their feet went out from under them. It was as if the ground itself had turned to grease. Men cursed, their arms windmilling. They went down in a chaotic, sticky, undignified heap, covered in orange pulp and humiliation. One of the drifters crashed headfirst into the hardware display, bringing down a cascade of tin pails. The move bought them 3 seconds. It was all they needed. Callion hauled Rowan through the side door of the livery. The air was warm, thick with the smell of hay, manure, and the rain drumming on the shingles. Blue smoke was in her stall, just as they had left her, saddled and ready. The roan snorted, her eyes wide, sensing the panic. "Up!" Callion ordered. He linked his hands, a human stirrup, and boosted Rowan. She grabbed the pommel, her boot finding his hands, and she was up, swinging her leg over the cantle. Her father's rifle was still there, secure in its scabbard. The 2 pistols they had packed were heavy in the saddlebags. Before she had even found her seat, Callion was in motion. He swung up behind her, his body light, settling on the horse's rump, his arms enclosing her. 1 heartbeat, 2 riders, 1 horse. "Go!" he said, his voice low in her ear. Rowan grabbed the reins and kicked. Blue smoke, a horse of muscle and heart, launched from the stall, thundering down the center of the livery. They burst out the wide main doors, scattering a half-dozen chickens and a stunned, open-mouthed liveryman who had been coming to see about the noise. They hit the muddy street at a full gallop, the horse's hooves throwing up great fans of mud. "Stop them!" Magnus Breyer was in the middle of the street, his fine coat ruined, his face purple, screaming at a pair of his own men who were just now riding in from the railroad camp. "My riders after them. $100 to the man who brings them down." Sheriff Pike, seeing his targets escape, had commandeered a dun mare tied to the rail. He spurred the horse viciously, pulling it around, and it lunged after them. Pike raised his pistol, firing a wild, panicked shot. The bullet whined past Rowan's head and thudded harmlessly into a wooden water trough. Behind them, the traveling Judge Thorne had finally emerged from the church, his black satchel held over his head to ward off the rain. He stood on the steps, howling into the storm. "Disorder! This is rank disorder! I will have you all held in contempt! This county has no jurisdiction!" No one was listening. He was a man of paper in a world of mud and water. Rowan leaned low over Blue Smoke's neck, urging the horse on. They galloped past the edge of town, onto the wagon-rutted trail that led toward Raven's Wash. But the town was coming with them. The congregation, having seen the escape, was not returning to its homes. Pulled by a force greater than fear, they were walking, a great, solemn, muddy crowd, up the trail. They were going to see. They had to see. As Rowan and Callion rode past the edge of the crowd, they saw the looks on the faces, the stunned, the angry, the hopeful, and then the crowd saw it, too. Where the trail bent, where the dry arroyo had always been a scar of dust and rock, there was now a river. It was not a trickle. It was a surging, wide, brown and white body of churning water, loud with the sound of its own power. It was magnificent. It was life. Cattle from a nearby pasture, their heads low, were already lined up on the bank, drinking deep. The skeletal groves of cottonwood that lined the wash were standing in a blessed, silver sheet of new water. The whispers that had been running through the crowd turned. They became a single, rising shout. "It's real, he did it! He damned it!" a woman screamed, pointing back at Breyer and Pike, who were still in pursuit. Breyer dammed the river. Just then, a heavy farm wagon, its wheels sinking deep, trundled up the path, pulled by 2 heavy draft horses. It was the mission's wagon, standing in the back, his small frame rigid, was Father Alonso Vega. He was holding the heavy oak altar box like a shield. "Stop," he commanded the driver. The wagon stopped. The crowd, now numbering 50 or more, gathered around it. Father Vega placed the box on the wagon bed and stood upon it, turning it into a pulpit, pike and briar. Seeing the crowd and the wagon blocking the path, hauled their horses to a skidding, muddy stop. Father Vega waited. The only sounds were the roar of the new river and the dripping rain. He reached into his cassock and pulled out the crisp, white envelope from the Territorial Engineering Office. "I will read this," he announced, his voice thin but carrying in the cold. Wet air. He read the engineer's words. He read illegal. He read public arterial. He read deeds voidable. He read the final, damning line. Arrests recommended for Magnus Breyer and any co-conspirators. A deep, profound silence fell over the crowd. They turned, as one body, and stared at Magnus Breyer. He sat on his horse, his face slick with rain. His riders fanned out behind him. He was no longer a titan of industry. He was just a thief. A ranch wife, Agnes Scott, a woman whose face was a map of drought and hardship, whose 2 sons had been forced to leave the territory to find work, stepped forward. She looked up at the wealthy man on his fine horse. She lifted her chin, her eyes dead, her voice flat. "You sold our sons drought," she said. The spell was broken. The fear, the awe, the power had all evaporated, washed away by the water. Sheriff Pike, caught between the armed men behind him and the 50 furious, righteous, and utterly silent stares in front of him, saw it. He saw the hands of the ranchers dropping to their holsters. He saw the end of his authority. He saw that his badge was just a piece of tin, and it was pinned to a coward. His arm, which had been raised to aim his pistol at Rowan one last time, slowly, almost painfully, lowered. He let the gun hang at his side, pointed at the mud. A movement at the edge of the crowd. Silas Crowther, who had been limping behind Pike's horse, his face a mask of sticky persimmon pulp, saw the gun lower. He saw the look on the crowd's faces. He did not wait. He gave one last look of pure venom at Breyer, and then he slipped backward, off the trail, into the dense, thorny, and forgiving tangle of mesquite. He vanished, a bad promise broken, a snake sliding back into the earth. From the high ridge above the wash, Rowan pulled Blue Smoke to a halt. Callion's hand was a steady, warm weight on her hip. They were safe. They looked down on the scene. They saw Father Vega standing on his box, holding the letter. They saw Breyer, frozen, his riders now looking at each other, their loyalty disintegrating. They saw Pike, his gun lowered, a man defeated, and they saw the town. The town was not shouting, it was not charging, it was just standing, watching, choosing. It was a people, silent and powerful, waking up to its own spine. It took 3 days for the territorial marshals to ride in. They were not heroes, and they were not saviors. They were just men, tired, paid by the territory, and accustomed to cleaning up the messes made by ambitious men. They rode in on weary horses, their badges dull with dust, and went straight to the mission. Father Alonso Vega, his hands perfectly steady, met them in the sheriff's office, which was empty. Sheriff Pike having not been seen since the incident at the church. The priest placed the heavy oak altar box on the desk. He turned the key. He laid out the pocket ledger. He laid out the forged deed addendum. And last, he laid out the territorial engineer's letter, with its crisp, official, blue wax seal. The marshals did not look at the ledger. They did not look at the forgery. They looked at the engineer's letter. They recognized the seal. One of them, the senior man, read it twice, his lips moving slightly. Then he folded it, tucked it into his own pocket, and nodded. It was enough. Magnus Breyer's arrest was a quiet, legal, and deeply anticlimactic event. They took him from his room at the hotel, where he had been sitting in the dark, drinking. He did not resist. His tailored coat was stained with the dried mud of the street. His face was gray. He was put in irons. He was walked to a transport wagon, and the town of Juniper Crossing came out to watch. They did not cheer. They did not jeer. They stood in the mud, silent, their faces hard, They just watched, as he passed Rowan, who stood on the boardwalk by the hardware store. His gaze, full of a cold, bottomless hatred, locked onto hers. He promised lawsuits. He promised appeals. He promised a ruin she could not yet imagine. Rowan did not flinch. She just watched him, until the wagon was small, and then gone. He had arrived in a fine, black buggy. He left in irons and mud, in the days that followed. Juniper Crossing began to breathe its own air again. Sheriff Pike's resignation was found tacked to his door, a piece of paper that no one bothered to take down. The town held a meeting, not in the church, but in the livery, the air smelling of hay and possibility. They formed a new water board, the first in the county. Agnes Scott, the ranch wife who had faced down Briar, was on it. 2 other ranchers, men who had lost everything in the drought, were on it. Father Vega, who argued for stewardship, was on it. Callion rode out, and 2 days later, he rode back. He was not alone. At his side, riding tall on a borrowed pony, was Taya Windrunner. She was thin, her face scarred by hardship, but her eyes were defiant. She and the remnants of her small camp had been found 20 miles south, surviving on what they could hunt. She was brought to the meeting. She did not speak English, and she did not need to. Callion spoke for her. She knew the springs, she knew the washes, she knew the deep. Old memory of the water. Her presence was a fact, and her knowledge was essential. She became the 5th member, the water. They agreed, belonged to everyone, or to no one. At Hale Orchard, the change was slow, but it was real. The water, no longer a flood, had settled into its rightful bed, a clear, steady current. It gurgled and sang as it soaked the parched earth. The dead trees remained dead, gray skeletons in the sun, but the 26 survivors looked different. A faint, almost imperceptible greening was visible at the tips of their branches. Rowan found her father's old, sun-bleached sign. Hale Orchard, half buried in the mud. The paint was peeling, the wood warped. She spent a morning scrubbing it clean, her hands aching, but it was a good ache. She took it to the gate, intending to rehang it on the old post. Callion stopped her. He was holding a heavy, straight post of stripped cedar. He had been working on it for a day. He dug a new hole, next to her father's. He set the cedar post deep in the wet earth, tamping it down until it was solid, a permanent part of the land. Then, with the knife he always carried, he began to carve. He did not carve a name. He carved a deep, clean image of a thunderbird, its wings spread wide, a symbol of the storm that had brought the water back. He stepped back. He nodded to her. Rowan hung her father's sign on the old post. The thunderbird stood guard beside it. 2 names, 2 symbols, 1 home. That night, they walked to the bluff. The moon was rising, full and clean, and it laid a sheet of silver across the new, living river. The wind came up from the wash, cool and sweet, tasting of rain and crushed mesquite. It was the first time in her life the desert air had tasted of hope. Rowan stood, watching the water. The victory was real. The land was safe, but the world was still the world. She wrapped her arms around herself, a small, worried gesture. Aunt Mavis was right, she said, her voice quiet, almost lost in the sound of the river. She said I would be ruined. Callion turned, watching her face in the moonlight. We have no preacher, Rowan continued, her voice low, worrying at the practical, sharp edges of her new life. The judge is gone. We have no papers in hand. In the eyes of the law, in the eyes of the town. So, I do not know papers, Callion said. His voice was gentle, as steady as the stone under their feet. I know the ground, I know the sky, I know what I saw in the church, I know what I see now. He stepped closer. I will stand where you ask me to stand. Rowan, I will say the words you ask me to say, or I will wait as long as you ask me to wait. He paused, his gaze clear and absolute. I'm here. She looked up at him, at the truth of him, a truth as solid as the mesa behind them, the world of paper of forged deeds and banknotes and contracts that felt like silk nooses. It all seemed thin, unreal. This was real. A smile broke through, and her eyelashes were suddenly, startlingly wet. "Then stand with me now," she whispered. "This is all the church I need." She moved toward him, and he met her. He did not kiss her. He rested his forehead against hers. They stood that way for a long time, just breathing, their breaths sinking, the silence between them more binding than any written oath. The river murmured below them, a witness older than law, older than any mission. He kissed her. It was slow, and it was grateful. It was not the desperate, frantic heat of the line shack. This was a kiss of arrival, of homecoming. The heat was there, a low, steady, and certain burn, but it was braided with the small, shaky laughter of pure relief. Her hands came up, not to pull him closer, but to hold. Her palms rested on his shoulders, feeling the solid, real muscle through his shirt. His hands, calloused and warm, came up to frame her jaw, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. Gently, as if she were something rare, they parted, just to breathe, just to look at each other in the silver light. A shared, silent acknowledgement of the impossible road they had walked. Then, as if drawn by a force they no longer questioned, they came together again. This kiss was sure. It was a promise, made and accepted. Later. The small house on the orchard was quiet. A single lamp burned, casting a warm, golden light across the rough-hewn walls. Outside, the world was still, the desert air cool. The sound of boots, heavy and worn, thudded softly onto the plank floor. Then the sound of lighter moccasins. There were whispers, low and soft, lost in the shadows. There were promises, spoken not in the language of law, but in the language of survival. There was the soft, sudden sound of laughter, quickly hushed, intimate and warm. The lamplight, having done its work, guttered and went out, leaving only silhouettes against the moonlit window, and the sound of heartbeats in the quiet room. Outside, the water threaded the dark flats, a living artery. In the orchard, the survivors drank deep. In the distance, the bell at Salt Cedar Mission, its rope now tied, was silent, at peace. Dawn broke, pale and clean, the copper sky of the drought gone, replaced by a clear, high blue. On the porch rail, Rowan and Callian sat, cups of hot coffee steaming in their hands. They were not touching, but they sat as one, watching the light. Junko, his duty done, was asleep at their feet, his tail twitching in a dream of the chase. In front of them, the river, their river, laid its bright, silver road straight into the heart of the morning. This was home, not a place they had found, or a place they had inherited, but a place they had made. Thank you for listening to this story. We're curious. Where in the world are you listening from? Let us know in the comments so we can connect and share your thoughts. Please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850, like this video, and give us extra support by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.